Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going to drift, very slowly, into one of those oddly specific historical rabbit holes that nobody asked for, but your brain refuses to ignore once the idea lands. So, go ahead, dim the lights, maybe adjust your blanket, maybe adjust your pillow again because it never feels quite right on the first try, and let your eyes relax. Because this evening, we're talking about something deeply ancient, mildly weird, and extremely human. How people cut their hair, around 10,000 years ago. Yeah. Long before scissors. Long before mirrors that weren't just water pretending to be helpful. Long before shampoo. Or conditioner. Or, hygiene. Hair existed, obviously. People existed. Hair kept growing. And somebody, somewhere, eventually said, okay, enough. This mammoth hunter mullet is getting out of hand. So let's float back, way, way back, to a world where hairstyles weren't a fashion choice, but simple survival, practicality, or occasionally just, whatever happened when a sharp rock met a bored human. Take a breath. And let's wander into the prehistoric salon. The first barbers were rocks, because of course they were. So let's imagine a random morning in 800 BCE. You wake up in your little shelter, maybe a hut, maybe a cave, maybe a disappointing pile of sticks you keep saying you're going to upgrade but never do. Your hair is in your face. Again. It's long, tangled, and decorated with approximately 4 species of unknown insects. And you think to yourself, I should cut this. Then you look around at your options. Let's see, sharp rock, another sharp rock, rock that's blunt for no reason, and a seashell somebody thought was pretty. That's it. Those are your tools. And honestly, that's pretty much where human hairstyling begins. Stone tools were the OG hair-cutting instruments. Not stylish. Not ergonomic. Not approved by any respectable salon. But they worked in the sense that hair eventually came off. Archaeologists have actually found early flint blades that show microscopic were marks consistent with cutting soft material, like hair. Which means yes, someone really sat there dragging a tiny blade of chipped stone across their head thinking, yeah, this is fine. If you've ever tried to cut your own hair with kitchen scissors, you already understand the vibe. Flint, the razor that didn't ask permission. Flint was basically the prehistoric equivalent of a professional razor, except far less forgiving and probably a little judgmental. When freshly chipped, flint blades are incredibly sharp, sharp enough to slice through hair, animal hides, and surprisingly often, fingers. Probably lots of fingers. You know, someone in the group always overestimated their skill and ended up holding their hand awkwardly for a few days. And here's the fun part. These blades dulled quickly. Like, after a few swipes. So prehistoric haircuts were probably a cycle of cut, dull, rechip, cut, dull, rechip, cut, dull, and eventually the person giving the haircut saying, you know what, it's good enough, even though the result looked like a wounded porcupine. This is the earliest known tradition of the bad haircut excuse, which humans have lovingly preserved to this day. Burning hair off, because why not double down on danger? Now, if sharp rocks weren't your thing, maybe you were accident-prone or had a healthy fear of blood loss, you could also go with a more dramatic option. Fire. Yes, people literally burned their hair off. This was not a gentle technique. Not spa-like. No scented candles. Just open flame and vibes. The process probably went something like: hold still. Whoosh. That's shorter. There would have been a smell. A very specific smell. A smell that probably made wild animals question their life choices. But it worked, sort of. It didn't give a clean line. But it prevented hair from getting too long, too tangled, or too full of unpleasant surprises. And honestly, 10,000 years ago, that was the entire grooming checklist. Shells, nature's attempt at scissors. If you were lucky enough to live near a coast, or at least near someone who enjoyed long walks on the beach before that was a personality trait, you might have access to seashells. Certain shells can actually clamp shut pretty tightly. Early humans used them like crude tweezers, or very depressed scissors. The technique was slow. Painfully slow. And the shell had this habit of occasionally deciding it wasn't doing this anymore and just letting go. But still, it was a method. A method slightly more refined than rocks or fire. And in prehistoric grooming standards, that basically made it luxury. Stone razors for shaving, a commitment to pain we still don't understand. Hair cutting is one thing. Shaving is another level of prehistoric nonsense. But yes, people shaved their faces, and sometimes their heads, using sharpened obsidian or flint. And obsidian, well, let's just say it's so sharp it can slice at a molecular level. Modern surgeons have tested obsidian scalpels. They're unbelievably sharp. But in 800 BCE, you're not getting a surgical tool. You're getting a fragment of glass-like rock that absolutely will cut you if you look at it wrong. So shaving in the Stone Age was probably a mix of intense concentration, heavy breathing, lots of tiny cuts, a questionable sense of pride when you finished. The final result? Not smooth. Not even. But hair-free enough to avoid your beard catching on fire while cooking over open flames. Which, you know, practical. Why cut hair at all? Because it wasn't about looking cute. Here's the interesting part. Cutting hair wasn't about beauty. It wasn't about fashion. And it definitely wasn't about impressing anyone unless your idea of romance was, I cut this with a rock for you. Hair cutting was mostly about survival. Long hair catches things. Like dirt, random twigs, bugs, more bugs, and occasionally your own hands while trying to do anything productive. In a hunting society, visibility matters. If your hair was constantly blowing into your eyes, you probably weren't going to survive long enough to complain about it. So trimming hair was less style decision and more, I'd like to see the mammoth before it sees me, thanks. Haircuts as rituals, because humans love making everything symbolic. As societies developed rituals, hair cutting became symbolic too. We don't have written records from 10,000 years ago. Writing hadn't even been invented yet, so everything is archaeological guesswork combined with our understanding of later customs. But in nearly every later culture on Earth, hair cutting had meaning. Coming of age, mourning, religious purification, punishment, marriage, entering adulthood. So it's very likely that even in Mesolithic or Neolithic communities, certain haircuts were done for reasons deeper than "my bangs are uneven." Even back then, humans were dramatic. It hasn't changed. Let's drift to the first styles, which were strange. Picture early humans with their freshly hacked and burned hair. There was no fade, no layering, no clean edges. It was the Stone Age equivalent of, "I cut this myself at 2 a.m. during a crisis." But over time, patterns formed. Some early societies preferred short hair to avoid lice, longer hair for warmth, tied hair for convenience, shaved heads for ritual, partially shaved patterns because humans love making things complicated. We can see hints of this in early figurines, small carved humans with what looks suspiciously like stylized hair. Though to be fair, some of those carvings look like the artist just gave up halfway. Very relatable. Social status and hair, yes, even then. Even without scissors, combs, or that one cousin who claims to be good at cutting hair, but absolutely isn't, hair became social. In later tribal groups, similar to prehistoric ones, hair could show your clan, your age, your marital status, whether you were a warrior, whether you'd achieved some milestone. So while 10,000 BCE hairstyles weren't runway ready, they mattered. You weren't just chopping hair. You were signaling something, even if the signal was, "I survived another winter," or "I picked the least dangerous rock to cut this with." The unspoken reality, not everyone cut their hair well. We need to be honest about something historically awkward. Not everyone was good at cutting hair. In fact, most people were probably bad at it. We've all seen modern attempts at self-haircuts. People with perfectly good equipment and YouTube tutorials still come out looking like a startled baby goat. Now imagine the results when your tools were a rock, a fire, a blunt shell, determination, and zero lighting. Let's just say the archaeological record might not show the full chaos of prehistoric hairstyles. But it existed. It absolutely existed. Children's hair, controlled by the only barber available. For kids, haircuts were done by adults. Probably the same adult who was also responsible for scraping hides, cooking food, yelling at the fire to stay lit, and occasionally telling you not to eat dirt. So children had whatever haircut that adult happened to give. Random trims, short in weird places, long in the back, unintentionally inventing prehistoric mullets thousands of years before they returned tragically in the 1980s. And honestly, the children probably didn't care. They were too busy trying not to get eaten by wolves. Let's float slowly toward one last thought. The sweetest, calmest, nicest detail about all this is something simple. Grooming was a social act. Even in 800 BCE, cutting someone's hair required trust. You needed someone steady, someone patient, someone who wouldn't accidentally slice your ear off. And that means haircuts, primitive as they were moments of connection. One person sitting. One person trimming. Quiet conversation. Shared time. A small gesture of care in a world where survival wasn't guaranteed. The Stone Age wasn't glamorous, but it was deeply human. And as we drift gently into the next part, we'll continue wandering through these tiny, intimate pieces of prehistoric life, those moments that made ancient people feel just a little bit more like us. Alright, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're already half asleep, that's perfectly fine too. We're in no rush here. This is the kind of topic that just drifts along, like a lazy river of mildly interesting prehistoric facts and gently sarcastic commentary. So let's settle in again, breathe slowly, unclench your jaw, and float back to a world where your choices for a haircut were a rock, a fire, or a determined friend who meant well but probably shouldn't have been trusted with sharp objects. Tonight, we slide deeper into the small, everyday world of hair, grooming, and the very odd things humans did long before barbers existed or before anyone knew what split ends were. Let's drift onward. Hair as a daily struggle, because prehistoric life was a group project. So imagine you've finished your once-in-a-blue-moon haircut. It's uneven. It's patchy. It's got the overall aesthetic of accidentally rolled too close to a thorn bush. But at least it's shorter. Except, the problems don't stop there. Hair maintenance in the Stone Age wasn't wash, condition, repeat. It was more like wash if you fall in a river. Condition, with what? Detangle occasionally, using fingers, sticks, or sheer emotional strength. And somehow, people managed. Even though their version of shampoo was water. Just water. If you were fancy, maybe sand. If you were very fancy, possibly crushed herbs that did absolutely nothing except smell faintly like dirt mixed with other dirt. But hair mattered. Even in nomadic groups, people genuinely cared how they looked, just in a different way. Not fashionable. Just organized enough not to get caught on branches every 5 minutes. Hair combing, the prehistoric battle against chaos. We have archaeological evidence, little carved bone combs from the Neolithic era. They're simple, small, and not even slightly ergonomic. But they tell us something important. People were tired of tangled hair. It's almost comforting to know that across 10,000 years of human evolution, one universal truth has persisted. Hair will tangle. And people will be annoyed about it. These early combs weren't for styling. They were for basic survival. The kind of survival where you try to remove a knot the size of a small rodent from your hair before going about your day. And yes, those combs also helped with lice. Because if there is one ancient enemy older than war, older than agriculture, older than writing, it's lice. Humanity has been at war with tiny insects since the dawn of time, and, spoiler alert, we never really won. So early grooming wasn't glamorous. It was just necessary. A slow process of detangling, brushing out bugs, brushing out dust, and occasionally brushing out your will to live. The first hair techniques, a generous word, but let's go with it. Let's float from combs back to cutting. If flint blades were the earliest razors, the technique was essentially 1. Grab a handful of hair. 2. Pull it straight. 3. Slice with a stone. 4. Hope for the best. There was probably a lot of wincing, a lot of unevenness, and the occasional moment where someone squinted critically and said, "Yeah, that's definitely hair." Early humans weren't striving for sharp bangs or edgy undercuts. They were striving for, short enough that I don't walk backward into a bush and become a temporary wildlife ecosystem. Even shaving wasn't smooth. Prehistoric razors tugged, pulled, scraped, and left the skin feeling like sandpaper that fought back. But people did it anyway. Either for comfort, or because rituals demanded it, or because sometimes you just get tired of your own reflection in a puddle of water that's pretending to be a mirror. Hairstyles in a world without rules, a creative free-for-all. And now we drift toward something fun to imagine. Since there were no barbers, no fashion magazines, no TikTok hair trends, no Pinterest boards titled Stone Age Hair Inspo. People did whatever worked. If you tie hair with sinew, you get one style. If you braid it for practical reasons, you get another. If you accidentally burn half of it off because you lean too close to the fire, you get a third. Some of the earliest braided hairpieces in history date back thousands of years. Not 10,000, but close enough to tell us this habit was ancient. Braids kept hair neat, kept lice at bay, and kept the wind from flinging your hair into your face at inopportune moments, like while trying to hunt something that did not want to be hunted. There were probably simple knots, ties, and wraps. Nothing fancy. Just practical. If someone's hair looked good, it was by accident or because they had a naturally cooperative scalp, an evolutionary advantage more valuable than we admit. Let's float toward a quiet scene. A prehistoric grooming moment. It's evening. A small group sits near a fire. Maybe a family. Maybe a little community that survived another long day. Someone is weaving a basket. Someone else is sharpening tools. Someone is staring blankly into the fire contemplating absolutely nothing. And someone is trimming another person's hair. Not rushed. Not professional. Just a gesture of care. Grooming wasn't an industry. It wasn't a job title. It was simply one human helping another human not look like a walking tumbleweed. It's actually quite peaceful if you imagine it. Soft firelight. Slow trimming. The quiet crackle of burning wood. Hair falling gently to the ground where it will later confuse an archaeologist who tries very hard to sound confident in their report. Even in a world of danger, every once in a while, there were moments like these, moments where humans paused, connected, and did something small and tender. Cultural meaning begins to form, even before writing existed. As societies grew larger and more complex, hair slowly gained meaning. Maybe long hair meant adulthood. Maybe a shaved head meant mourning. Maybe certain styles meant belonging to a specific group. We can only guess by looking at later cultures, and those guesses are surprisingly reasonable. Human beings have always loved using hair to express something, even if that something was just, "Look at me, I survived winter." Barely. And even 10,000 years ago, people definitely had opinions about each other's hair. Someone somewhere absolutely said, "Ugh, what did they do to their head?" And then acted like they weren't being judgmental. Human nature doesn't change as fast as hairstyles do. Hair accessories, yes, they had those too. Believe it or not, early humans used bone pins, wooden sticks, sinew ties, plant fibers, beads, carved animal teeth, to decorate their hair or hold it in place. You can almost picture someone proudly sticking a bone into their hair and thinking, "Yep, this is the look." Iconic. And honestly, it was iconic. Because nobody else on Earth had figured out bones as hairpins yet. Pure innovation. These accessories weren't just decorative. They kept hair functional, out of the eyes, off the neck, and away from the fire that everyone gathered around because central heating had not been invented yet. Hair length and climate, a very chill relationship. Let's drift briefly into something practical. Climate-influenced hair choices. If you lived somewhere cold, long hair helped keep your neck warm. It was basically a built-in scarf. If you lived somewhere hot, shorter hair was more comfortable. Or tied hair. Or shaved hair if rituals allowed it. This wasn't fashion. It wasn't personal preference. It was just survival. Nobody in 800 BCE was thinking, "I want something that frames my face nicely." They were thinking, "I don't want my hair to ice over again." Hair care ingredients, nature's very limited catalog. There weren't many options. But early humans applied clay, ash, mud, crushed herbs, animal fat to their hair. Some mixtures probably helped. Some probably smelled awful. Some probably did nothing except amuse the rest of the group. Animal fat, though, actually worked. It conditioned hair. Made it easier to braid. Made it slightly shiny in a greased mammoth kind of way. Mud. Less effective. More, my scalp is now a tiny ecosystem. Humans were figuring things out. Slowly. Experimentally. Often unsuccessfully. It's comforting to know trial and error has always been our default method of discovery. One last slow drift before we pause. Let's end this part with a soft thought. Even tens of thousands of years ago, long before tools, long before cities, long before the idea of hairstyle existed, people still cared about hair. They cut it, trimmed it, tamed it, decorated it, shaved it, braided it, burned it off when it annoyed them, and used whatever nature handed them to make it manageable. Because even in the most ancient times, humans wanted to look like themselves, but just a little bit tidier. And that's kind of sweet. Hey guys. Tonight, we're going to do something a little strange, but you're already here, tucked under a blanket or pretending to work with headphones on, so why not drift through a gentle, slightly morbid stroll through history? So, dim your lights. Let your shoulders relax. Let your brain slow down like an old Windows XP loading bar. And let's float back, slowly, quietly, to a time long before coffins existed. A time when humans were just trying to figure things out, including what to do when someone inconveniently stopped being alive. Because yeah, before glossy wooden boxes with brass handles, humans tried basically everything. And I mean everything. Some ideas were touching. Some were pragmatic. Some were eyebrow-raising in the "oh, okay then" sort of way. But don't worry, nothing here is shocking or dramatic. Just mildly odd, gently weird, and historically sleepy. Let's begin somewhere extremely ancient. Like ancient. Long before the words Egypt, Sumer, or my parents are going to kill me even existed. The very first problem, the body is still here, but the person is not. Early humans didn't know what death was. And honestly, most of us still don't. Imagine being a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. Someone in your group has died. They're lying there. Very still. Not participating. Not contributing to the mammoth hunting WhatsApp group chat. And the big question becomes, okay, but where do we put him? There were no cemeteries. No priests. No funeral directors with dramatic hand gestures. So early humans had to improvise. And humans, being humans, improvised in about 20 different directions at once. Option number 1, just leave them there. One of the earliest burial customs, if we can even give it that much credit, was simply walking away. Not disrespectfully. Not intentionally. More like, we're nomadic, we have places to be. Nature can handle this one. And nature did. Wolves, birds, insects, everybody contributed. It wasn't elegant. But it was practical. But over time, early humans realized two things. 1. Bodies smell. 2. Bodies attract animals that are much too interested in you next. So eventually, leaving grandma wherever she fell was no longer ideal. Especially if grandma had died right next to the sleeping area. That's when humans started burying people. And surprisingly, they did this very early. Option number 2, burials. But cute and minimalist. Some of the oldest confirmed burials are around 100,000 years old. That's older than every culture you've ever heard of. Older than agriculture. Older than your last breakup. Much older. These weren't elaborate. No pyramids. No fancy jewelry. No thoughts and prayers, speeches. Just digging a shallow pit. Placing the body inside. Covering it with dirt. Maybe adding a stone or two on top so hyenas don't treat it like a snack bar. This tells us two things. 1. Early humans were surprisingly sentimental. They didn't just dump bodies off cliffs like unwanted furniture. 2. But they were also realistic. Because absolutely nobody wants predators sniffing around the camp like an overeager dog. Some early burials even show red ochre sprinkled over the body, kind of like paprika seasoning, but symbolic. Maybe representing blood, life, or this is the burial spot, not a free cave seat. We don't know for sure. Archaeologists love pretending they know. But they're guessing. Politely guessing. Option number 3, let's decorate the bones. Some groups didn't necessarily bury a whole person. Instead, they waited. They let nature do its thing. And once the soft parts were gone, they collected the bones like Pokemon cards. Skulls, especially, became the MVPs. Skulls were painted, carved, decorated, kept in houses, arranged in small groups like a prehistoric family photo. It sounds spooky now, but back then it was probably comforting. Like keeping a reminder of your loved one, except it's their actual head. A few cultures even shaped skulls with plaster to reconstruct the face. Think of it as the earliest attempt at 3D modeling. It wasn't always accurate, but nobody complained, mostly because complaining requires vocal cords. Option number 4, sky burial, aka return to sender. Now, let's drift gently to Central Asia and the Tibetan Plateau, where people had a very different idea. Instead of burying the dead, they laid the body out in the open for birds, especially vultures, to eat. Calmly. Respectfully. This wasn't considered disgusting. It was sacred. The idea was, the body is temporary. Let nature recycle it. And to be fair, vultures are extremely efficient workers. They show up on time. They finish the job. They don't talk back. Plus, the ground is rocky and the soil is frozen half the year. Digging a grave there is basically CrossFit. Nobody wants that. So, sky burial, naturally efficient, spiritually meaningful, and, at least in the Tibetan worldview, pretty elegant. Option number 5, water burials. Because rivers don't judge. Some groups placed their dead in rivers or lakes. Sometimes intentionally. Sometimes because the river was just the easiest place to put someone when the ground was too hard. Bodies float. Bodies drift. Bodies get taken downstream. Problem solved. Vikings did this. Siberian tribes did this. Even ancient India had rituals of letting bodies drift after partial cremation. But we're not getting dramatic here. No fiery Viking ships shooting flaming arrows into the night sky. That's Hollywood. Real water burials were more like, okay, just push the boat. No, gently. Yes, gently. There it goes, hopefully not into that log. Option number 6, tree burials. Hanging out the dead. Several cultures, especially in Siberia, Mongolia, and parts of North America, placed bodies in trees. Not like Christmas decorations, but close. They believed keeping the body off the ground helped the soul reach the sky. Or simply kept animals from chewing on things they shouldn't chew on. The bodies were wrapped in leather, bark, or simple cloth, and gently placed on branches. Eventually, nature took over. The wind. The birds. The process was slow, but so peaceful that even describing it feels like an ASMR session. Option number 7, cave burials. The original family crypt. Caves were basically nature's coffins before coffins. Dark. Quiet. Temperature controlled. Low maintenance. No HOA fees. Neanderthals used caves. So did early Homo sapiens. Whole families were stored in them like a prehistoric version of long-term storage. Archaeologists find clusters of bones, small tools, traces of ochre, beads, the occasional leftover meal, because apparently someone ate snacks at funerals. But overall, caves were reliable. No digging. No animals. No weather issues. Just, place the body inside and close the door. If caves had Yelp pages, funerals would have given them 5 stars. Option number 8, mummification. But not just Egypt. Egypt gets all the attention. And sure, they perfected the art of turning corpses into well-wrapped raisins. But they were far from alone. People all over the world tried mummification. The Chinchorro people in Chile. Some ancient Chinese cultures. The Guanches of the Canary Islands. Various groups across the Andes. Some wrapped bodies in cloth. Some dried them in deserts. Some smoked them over fires like jerky. Again, it wasn't dramatic. Just extremely practical. How do we keep Grandma around, without Grandma becoming a problem? Mummification meant the body stayed intact. Clean. Manageable. Perfect if your belief system involved ancestors watching over you. Or judging you. Or, most likely, mildly disapproving of your life choices. The odd, calm world of ancestor worship. A surprising number of ancient societies believed their dead relatives remained part of the household. As in, literally, inside the house, sitting in a corner, forever. But relax, we're not talking jump scares. It was extremely normal to them. Like having a framed photo, except the photo had bones. People fed their ancestors, spoke to them, asked for advice, apologized to them after bad decisions. It was a very functional family dynamic, if you ignore the whole "they're dead" part. Option number 9, cremation. Slow, calm, practical. Cremation is much older than most people think. Some of the earliest intentional cremations go back 40,000 years, which is wild considering humans at the time barely had consistent footwear. They placed bodies on open-air platforms and burned them slowly. Not dramatically. Not pyrotechnically. More like a controlled, peaceful fire that took hours. Ashes were sometimes collected, sometimes scattered, sometimes simply left where they fell. Cremation spread because it's efficient. Animals won't interfere. The body doesn't linger. It fits spiritual beliefs in many cultures. Plus, cremation allowed people to keep a little souvenir, an urn, a handful of ash, or in some cases, a single bone piece worn as jewelry. Very subtle. Very minimalist. Option number 10, exposure. But with style. This method isn't sky burial exactly. It's more like leaving the body in a designated area where nature takes its course peacefully and predictably. Large flat stones. Sheltered ledges. Open plains. No ritual. No fire. Just a very gentle return to nature. It sounds bleak, but imagine it from their perspective. Death was natural. Bodies were natural. Birds were natural. Weather was natural. Everything fit into a cosmic recycling loop. People weren't scared of this. They accepted it the way we accept that our phone batteries will eventually die at 3%, even though they promised 15 minutes left. The gradual arrival of coffins. Coffins are surprisingly new. Only around 4,000 to 5,000 years old, give or take. They evolved from simple pits, stone slabs, woven baskets, hollowed tree trunks, clay containers, or basically anything humans could shape into a body container. The earliest coffins were oval, chunky, extremely airtight, extremely uncomfortable, though nobody using them complained. Egyptians used wooden coffins layered with art. The Chinese used thick wooden boxes that weighed as much as a small elephant. Europeans used simple rectangular coffins only much later. But before all that, the body was just a body. And the world was a big place full of open possibilities, and open burial methods. Floating into the next part. And now that we've wandered through the earliest, gentlest, and occasionally odd ways humans handled death before coffins, it's time to drift forward into more complex ideas. More rituals. More strange customs. More calm ancient weirdness. But we'll save that for the next part. Alright, welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. If not, honestly, that's kind of the point. But assuming you're still semi-conscious and floating in that peaceful limbo where time doesn't really exist, let's gently continue wandering through the older, quieter corners of humanity. Last time, we talked about the earliest ways humans handled death. Sky burials, cave burials, river burials, basically every burial except the usual, put them in a box and lower them slowly like a malfunctioning elevator. Now let's drift deeper into the Bronze Age, where humans were experimenting with more decorative ways of storing dead relatives. Because once agriculture showed up, people got more time on their hands, and apparently the first thing they said was, "Let's make funerals weird." And honestly, they delivered. The era when people started decorating graves like Pinterest boards. Once humans settled into villages, graves became aesthetic. Not stylish. Not chic. Just noticeably intentional. Imagine a quiet ancient settlement. Little mud houses. Smoke gently drifting from fires. And just outside the village, you'd find the burial area, which was slowly becoming a gallery of humanity's earliest attempts at interior design. Graves contained pottery, beads, shells, tools, favorite foods, and sometimes an emotionally confusing number of animal bones. Not because animals were buried with them. No. Because the funeral included a meal, and people ate around the grave, then tossed leftovers inside like they were feeding a cosmic compost bin. It's actually kind of adorable. A little messy. But adorable. Archaeologists often describe it as ritual feasting, which is the academic way of saying they had a potluck, and then everyone yeeted the bones into the grave. It wasn't disrespectful. It was communal. A way of saying, "Hey, we're here. We remember you. Also, here's a chicken bone." The obsession with grave goods. As settlements grew, so did social hierarchies. And with that came a very human instinct. Let's show off. Even in death. Rich people began stuffing their graves with gold ornaments, fancy weapons, exotic stones, embroidered clothing. Poor people got a pottery bowl. Maybe. If the family liked them. This is when the first truly elaborate burials appear. The ones that later archaeologists get extremely excited about, even though the people inside have been asleep for thousands of years. Some graves even included entire miniature toolkits, knives, axes, spoons, as if the dead person was going to need to cook dinner in the afterlife. Which raises questions, but we're not here to solve them. We're just here to drift through them calmly. Secondary burials, the "we'll bury them again later" approach. One of the most intriguingly sleepy traditions was the secondary burial. This is how it worked. 1. Someone dies. 2. They get buried, temporarily. 3. The family waits months or years. 4. When the body is mostly bones, they dig it back up. 5. They gather the bones gently. 6. They rebury them properly in a new place. No drama. No screaming. Just a quiet, methodical, let's try this again. Why? Beliefs varied. Some said the soul took time to leave the body. Others believed bones were sacred. And some cultures simply preferred dealing with clean, dry skeletons instead of, well, anything else. It was peaceful, ritualized housekeeping for the dead. And in many societies, this practice survived for millennia. The ossuary phase, when bones got their own real estate. By the time we reach the early Mediterranean world, humans have officially entered their bone organization era. Enter the ossuary, a small container, stone, clay, or wooden, designed specifically for bones. Basically the ancient version of a storage box from IKEA, except heavier and much more symbolic. The routine was: let the body decompose. Collect the bones. Place them in an ossuary. Stack the ossuary with hundreds of others. Neat. Organized. Compact. The ancient world's most solemn filing system. You'll find this everywhere. Greece. Rome. Israel. Cyprus. Parts of Persia. Some ossuaries were beautifully carved with geometric patterns or floral designs. Others were plain boxes that said, essentially, "Here lie the bones. Please do not shuffle." The surprisingly calm practice of disarticulating bodies. In some cultures, when the soft tissues were gone, families would separate the bones, gently, and place them in different spots. Not in a creepy way. In a respectful, each piece has meaning way. The skull often got special treatment, sometimes placed in a designated corner or a separate shrine. Not because of horror. Because of honor. The skull symbolized identity, memory, ancestry. If you ever wondered why so many ancient cultures worshipped ancestors directly, well, this is part of it. Their remains were physically present. Close. Tangible. It's hard to forget a relative when their skull is literally on a shelf watching you bake bread. The Bronze Age house tombs, because who doesn't want a mini house when they're dead? In parts of ancient Europe, especially the Mediterranean, people started building tiny houses specifically for burials. Some were large enough for multiple bodies. Some were the size of a toddler's playhouse. All of them were early attempts at architecture meets funeral. These little house tombs symbolized comfort, home, stability. The idea that the dead weren't gone, they just moved into their slightly smaller, less ventilated house next door. In some communities, families visited these tombs often. And by visited, I mean cleaned them, repaired the roof, brought small food offerings, chatted with the dead the way we talk to framed photos. It's surprisingly wholesome. A little sleepy. A little wholesome. Very Bronze Age. And then, people started burying the dead under their houses. This one was common across early Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia. Yes. People literally buried Grandpa under the living room floor. Why? Protection. Ancestral presence. Convenience. And probably because cemeteries weren't invented yet. Archaeologists often find skeletons beneath ancient home floors. Neatly buried. Curled in fetal position. Sometimes with beads or stone tools. Sometimes without a single item, because minimalism existed even then. Imagine living your daily life knowing 3 generations of relatives were quietly resting under your feet while you cooked dinner. It wasn't eerie to them. It was comforting. A constant reminder. You're not alone. Your family is literally right below you. Sometimes too literally. The shift toward monument burials. As societies grew richer, burials started scaling up like ancient Apple products. Small graves, bigger tombs, huge burial mounds, full-blown monuments. These mounds, often called barrows, were raised earth structures, sometimes ringed with stones, sometimes containing multiple burials, occasionally decorated with carvings. Barrows appear in Britain, Scandinavia, the Eurasian steppe, ancient China, the Middle East. Some are tiny. Some are the size of small hills. Some accidentally became popular hiking spots thousands of years later. Inside the mounds, bodies were placed with careful arrangement. Supine. Curled. Surrounded by pottery. Or in a wooden chamber that was basically the prehistoric version of coffin-like. These structures didn't involve coffins yet. Just bodies placed comfortably inside wooden or stone compartments, like storage units with better views. The quiet rise of burial chambers. By the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, some communities began constructing stone burial chambers. Imagine them like small walk-in closets, except absolutely nobody walks in voluntarily. These chambers housed families, whole clans. Occasionally, someone who probably wasn't family, but archaeologists politely avoid asking. Some chambers had benches, platforms, decorated walls, and carefully sorted bone piles. Later, when new bodies arrived, the old bones were pushed gently aside to make room. Kind of like rearranging your storage room when new winter clothes arrive. No drama. No fuss. Just a casual, sorry grandpa, scooting you over a bit. The calm practicality of wooden log coffins. Before the fancy carved coffins we think of today, the earliest, box-style, burials came from, drumroll, trees. People simply hollowed out logs and placed bodies inside. These were easy to make, surprisingly durable, natural, and basically the ancient version of eco-friendly burial. Northern and Central European cultures favored these. Bog burials especially used wooden log coffins because they preserved things so well the body sometimes looked like it took a long nap instead of the alternative. The bog didn't judge. It just preserved everything like a slightly over-enthusiastic refrigerator. The gentle transition into true coffins. Finally, after tens of thousands of years of trying every burial method except put them in a rectangle, humans started making real coffins. Egypt went fancy. China went heavy. Europe went practical. The Middle East went symbolic. And eventually the wooden coffin became universal. But before that, humanity spent over 95% of its timeline burying people without boxes. And honestly, they managed just fine. Hey guys. Tonight we're gliding back into the medieval world, where armor was shiny, grooming was optional, and the average knight probably smelled like a damp horse mixed with optimism. So, dim the lights. Get comfortable. And let's wander slowly into this surprisingly quiet question. What actually happened to medieval knights when they grew old? Because the movies will tell you they dramatically died in epic battles at age 32, hair blowing in the wind, theme music swelling in the background. But, no. Real knights lived long enough to have back problems, knee issues, and a long list of regrets about wearing 60 pounds of metal every day. So tonight, we're letting the horses sleep, putting away the lances, and floating through the surprisingly ordinary, occasionally depressing, and mildly entertaining retirement plans of the men who once charged into battle yelling, "For glory!" And then somehow lived long enough to say, "For a warm blanket and some soup, please." Let's drift into it. Floating to the early years of knighthood. Before we talk about old age, we kind of have to remind ourselves that knights did not start off as glamorous, armor-clad icons. Most of them began as tiny, malnourished 7-year-olds sent away from home to become pages. It was basically medieval boarding school but with more horse manure and fewer opportunities to express their feelings. If a knight lived to be old, he was basically a miracle. He had survived childhood disease, violent tournaments, multiple wars, loyalty to nobles with questionable decision-making skills. So if a knight reached the age of 50, he was basically the medieval equivalent of a grand wizard of survival. And by survival, I mean he could still stand upright for 20 minutes at a time. So, what did old even mean? Now, medieval old age was not our modern old age. You weren't ancient at 40, like movies say, but you did start feeling those saddle-induced knee problems earlier than you'd like. If you were 40, you were experienced. 50, you were veteran material. 60 plus, you were, how are you still alive? 70 plus, people assumed you had struck some kind of deal with the local monastery or maybe a minor forest spirit. The point is, knights did grow old. And once they crossed into the zone where their back made new sounds every morning, society had interesting expectations for them. Let's float to retirement option number 1, becoming a castle grandpa. The first and most common fate of an aging knight was becoming something I will lovingly call the castle grandpa. This was the guy who once led cavalry charges but now spent his days shuffling around castle courtyards, giving advice nobody asked for, telling long stories that started with, "in my day," inspecting armor and muttering that young knights don't oil their chainmail properly anymore. They weren't useless. Actually, they played important roles. They trained new knights. They managed stables. They supervised the armory. They tried to prevent teenagers from stabbing each other in tournaments. Picture a man with a long gray mustache leaning on a wooden staff, watching two 15-year-olds whack each other with wooden swords and whispering, "Yes, excellent, use your elbows." This was glamorous retirement, medieval style. Option number 2, becoming a knightly bureaucrat. Now, some knights didn't want to retire. Or maybe they couldn't afford to. And so they transitioned to something arguably worse than war. Paperwork. Old knights often became sheriffs, stewards, castellans, estate managers. Basically, imagine a man who spent 30 years stabbing people now being told, "Here is a ledger. Please keep track of grain storage and tenant complaints." The emotional damage was probably intense, but at least the risk of being hit with a spear dropped significantly. Option number 3, the reluctant farmer phase. For knights who weren't wealthy enough to retire in a castle, there was another fate. One that medieval chronicles politely never talk about, but absolutely happened. They went home. To their farms. To work the land. As middle-aged, ex-warrior farmers still trying to look impressive while feeding chickens. Imagine a knight who once charged into battle returning home and having to negotiate milking rights with a stubborn goat. Life came at them fast. These knights lived fairly quiet lives, but they kept their swords, of course, just in case someone insulted their crops or the neighbor complained about their cow again. Option number 4, getting a nice, cozy monastery room. Ah yes, the monastic retirement plan. A surprisingly large number of knights ended up in monasteries. Why? Well, food was guaranteed. There was minimal stabbing. You could sit down a lot. The daily schedule involved prayers, not tournaments. And most importantly, monks did not expect you to run anywhere. Some knights joined monasteries because they felt guilty about the whole killing people for decades part. Others joined because they were broke. And some joined because their families gently suggested it, as in, "Father, maybe it's time you stop challenging people to duels over cheese prices." Monasteries welcomed them, though. An ex-knight was basically free security. Option number 5, becoming a knight pensioner. Believe it or not, medieval pensions existed. Not the generous kind, of course. Think more. You dedicated your life to serving the king. Here is a small patch of land and maybe a chicken. Some kings gave old knights tiny estates, rent-free cottages, a few servants, the right to hunt rabbits on royal land, a ceremonial role like keeper of the king's nap room. It wasn't glamorous, but hey, it paid the bills. And knights liked anything that kept them away from plowing fields themselves. Option number 6, the sad, slightly forgotten knight. Not every knight aged gracefully. Some were injured beyond active service and became, well, background characters in medieval society. They lived off charity, local nobles' goodwill, the church, whatever coins they earned telling stories at taverns. Picture an older knight sitting near a fireplace telling exaggerated stories of his youth, while villagers quietly wonder whether he actually fought 5 bears at once or just saw a dog in the dark. Life wasn't kind to everyone, but this was still better than the other medieval career option. Being dead. Option number 7, becoming the grumpy local legend. Every medieval village had at least one retired knight who had a big gray beard, a permanent frown, and a reputation for yelling at children. These men were called upon whenever a wolf was spotted, someone needed to settle a land dispute, the village wanted to show off during festivals. But mostly, they just lived quietly, swinging their sword at a tree now and then to stay sharp, even though their back politely disagreed. Transition moment, floating into something sadder. Let's drift gently to another corner of medieval reality. Because not all knightly retirements were peaceful. And some were, frankly, depressing in that slow, sleepy historical way. No drama. No suspense. Just the slightly inevitable fate of men who spent their youth being hit with metal objects. Option number 8, the knight who kept fighting, way too long. Some knights simply refused to retire. They kept fighting into their 50s, 60s, and occasionally 70s, insisting they were still in prime condition, while their joints loudly disagreed. These knights were usually overly proud, extremely stubborn, allergic to sitting still, and convinced that battle wounds built character. The problem? They became liabilities. Slow, hard to protect, and occasionally distracted by back pain in the middle of combat. Historical records politely call them honored veterans, which is medieval historian code for he shouldn't have been there, but nobody could stop him. Option number 9, the knight who became a problem for everyone. Some aging knights did not handle retirement well. They became petty, jealous, difficult, obsessed with honor, and very willing to start feuds over absolutely nothing. Imagine trying to enjoy your bread and stew, and an elderly knight suddenly challenges you because your spoon angled slightly toward him. Local lords occasionally had to say things like, "Sir Geoffrey, please stop dueling the farmers." Sometimes they gave these knights tiny jobs to keep them busy, the medieval equivalent of giving a fidgety grandpa a bird feeder project. Option number 10, the knight who wanted to be remembered. A surprising number of old knights spent their final years trying to secure their legacy, which usually meant dictating long, rambling memoirs to monks, commissioning tombs with heroic carvings, telling their sons to never forget the glory of our name, reminding everyone they once wore armor tighter than their modern waistline would allow. These knights desperately wanted to be seen as noble heroes. But the truth is, most ended up known for being fine. Not great. Not terrible. Just fine. Which, honestly, is more realistic for people who spent their lives following orders from kings who rarely knew what they were doing. Option number 11, the knight who finally found peace. And of course, many knights simply grew old quietly. Surrounded by children, grandchildren, a warm fire, and absolutely no interest in ever lifting a sword again. These men embraced peace the same way modern people embrace a soft pillow. No drama. No battles. Just quiet evenings and gentle regrets. This was probably the best ending they could hope for.